All right, I'm going to run through a quick review on the parts of a neuron. So today we're going to just look at the typical structure of a typical neuron. We've gone over this before. On the left, you see the dendrites. Those are those branch-like structures that are attached to the cell body. The cell body is called the soma. On your test, it'll be soma. The dendrites have little receptor sites on them, and they'll receive the signal. The neurotransmitters are the signal. They'll receive the neurotransmitters on those receptor sites. Once they get enough neurotransmitters to reach threshold, then the soma, the cell body, will initiate that action potential. Okay. Across the middle, we have, don't worry about nucleus, it won't be on the test. Okay. Cell body is soma. You'll see soma on the test for sure. All right. Then you have the axon that runs off of the cell body, and it is covered by the myelin sheath. So the axon is where the action potential is going to occur. That is thing we talk about when we talk about depolarization. That's going to be the axon. It's covered by the myelin sheath. Remember that the myelin sheath is something that protects the axon, and it also speeds up transmission of the neural signal. If you start to have deterioration of that myelin sheath, that's commonly associated with multiple sclerosis, and they have problems with movement and things like that. So that's the myelin sheath. Remember, the myelin and multiple sclerosis, the M's go together. When you do diseases for this unit, then you want to keep those together, okay? The nodes of Ranvier and the Schwann cell, those are like higher level questions. You might see those on the AP exam, but you probably won't see them tomorrow. Nodes of Ranvier are just the spaces between the Schwann cells of the myelin sheath. So that's really what you're looking at. Then at the end of the axon, it breaks into these axon terminals, and on each end of each terminal are terminal buttons. Remember that the terminal buttons have vesicles that hold the neurotransmitters. And so when the neuron fires, that electric signal will cause the terminal buttons to release those neurotransmitters into the synapse. Remember that the synapse is the space between the axon terminals of one neuron and the dendrites of the next neuron, and the space between them is called the synapse. You got to know all those pieces and parts. All right, you got to know how the neuron fires. So here's two nice little neurons that can help us. All right, when the neuron's waiting to receive neurotransmitters, waiting for the signal, so the dendrites are waiting for neurotransmitters to bind to those receptor sites, it is at resting potential. At resting potential, it's polarized, not polaroid, polarized, and it has negative potassium ions inside the axon membrane. And there are sodium, positively charged sodium ions outside of the axon membrane. And so that's resting potential. It's just waiting to receive the signal so that enough signal to initiate an action potential. And so the minimum amount of neurotransmitters it needs is called threshold, the minimum amount of neurotransmitters to initiate that action potential. Remember that threshold is all or nothing. Either there are enough excitatory neurotransmitters to reach threshold and the neuron fires, or if there are not enough, it just won't fire. There's no halfway. Okay, the action potential is initiated by the soma, which is the cell body. Once threshold is reached, it'll initiate the action potential. Then it goes from a chemical signal, neurotransmitters, to an electrical signal. And what happens is along the axon, the channels will open up, their little channels will open up and allow those sodium ions that were on the outside to come into the inside of the axon membrane and mix with negatively charged potassium ions. That's going to cause the negative mixing with the positive, the positive sodium ions mixing with the negative potassium ions is going to cause electricity. It's going to cause that electric signal, and it'll move on down the axon, and channels will keep opening and more electricity until it gets all the way to the end. So it's sending an electrical impulse down the axon. So what was a chemical message, okay, it came into the dendrites, the neurotransmitters bound to the receptor sites, reached threshold, initiate the action potential. The action potential is now an electric signal, and it's traveling down the ions. Once it reaches the end of the axons, those axon terminals, the terminal buttons will release that neuron's neurotransmitters into the synapse, okay? The neuron that fires is the presynaptic neuron, okay? It fires its neurotransmitters into the synapse. Sometimes they call it the synaptic cleft, sometimes the synaptic gap. And then those neurotransmitters will go and bind themselves to the dendrites of the next axon, of the next neuron. And that's called the postsynaptic neuron. Remember, they never touch each other. There's always a tiny little space between neurons called the synapse or the synaptic cleft or the synaptic gap. It's all the same for us, okay? Once the neuron fires, it has to recover, okay? It really is going to repolarize. So it was depolarized during an action potential, okay? Depolarized means it mixed the negatives and the positives. Once it fires, it needs to repolarize. And so it's going to have to push out the sodium, the positive sodium, and separate the sodium from the potassium, okay? And it needs to become polarized again, all right? That period where it's resetting itself, where it's repolarizing, is called the refractory period. During that period, it doesn't matter how many neurotransmitters might bind to the dendrites, it cannot fire during the refractory period. It won't fire until it pushes out those sodium ions and it gets back to resting potential. Resting potential is when it's polarized and now the dendrites are waiting for signal. Okay, so resting potential is polarized. Action potential is depolarized. Refractory period is when it's repolarizing and it cannot fire. And that's it for that standard, okay? So for standard 2 neurotransmitters, you gotta know your neurotransmitters. And so you need to know acetylcholine is on there always, right? It helps us with muscle movement and memory and learning. It is always associated with Alzheimer's. There will be an Alzheimer's question on the test. There always is. Remember, Alzheimer's starts with an A, acetylcholine starts with an A. The A's go together. Okay, so acetylcholine and Alzheimer's. Dopamine. Dopamine helps us with attention, emotion, learning. The big things for dopamine is if you have too much dopamine, that is linked to schizophrenia, and too little is linked to Parkinson's disease. Students always used to use this, like if you have too much dope, you're schizophrenic. And if you don't have enough dope, you got to go to the park, okay? So Parkinson's is too little dopamine. If that helps you remember, great. Whatever it takes, okay? Serotonin is mood. Remember, serotonin's our feel-good neurotransmitter. If you don't have enough of it, it's linked to depression, okay? So mood and serotonin. Remember that to treat depression, the medications are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, and they block the reuptake of neurotransmitters. Remember, reuptake, I didn't talk about it with the neuron, but reuptake happens when the neuron fires. There's always leftovers in the synapse, and so the presynaptic neuron, the one that fires, will suck those back up into the vesicles. So it'll take them back up, reuptake. With serotonin, with the SSRI, depression medication, it blocks the serotonin from being taken back up from the reuptake, and so that there's more serotonin floating around out in the gap. So that helps with mood. Norepinephrine, remember, it's the hybrid. It's part neurotransmitter, part hormone, okay? So that's the hybrid one. It helps with alertness and arousal, okay? I don't think you have to worry about, you really need to know that it is part hormone, part neurotransmitter. Remember, it's secreted or it comes from the adrenal glands, or if it goes through the blood, it's going to be as a hormone, as non-adrenaline. If it goes through across the neurons, across the nerves, it's a neurotransmitter, and it's called norepinephrine. Okay, so remember that. GABA, the question will always be that it's a major inhibitory neurotransmitter. If you see the words major inhibitory neurotransmitter, it's GABA, okay? And you just got to remember that. Too little, you could have seizures. So if you see anything about seizures, GABA, okay? Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It's involved with memory, but almost always the glutamate question is major excitatory neurotransmitter. If you see anything about migraines, headaches, anything like that, then that's going to be glutamate. Agonist and antagonist. Remember, an agonist is going to mimic a neurotransmitter. So like if you have botulinum is what they use in Botox, okay? It's going to mimic acetylcholine, right? And so then you also have antagonists. And I think I did that wrong. So let me pause that for a second. Okay, I absolutely said that wrong. Botulinum is an antagonist. So agonist mimics, antagonist creates it blocks the effect. So botulinum is an antagonist of ACH. Botulinum is Botox. It won't let your facial muscles move. That's why your face looks so nice and tight. When you get old, you want to put it in there. All right, so botulinum acts as an antagonist, okay? It's going to block the effects of ACH, which allows your muscles to move, all right? The agonist, okay, so agonist mimic would be black widow venom is an agonist for acetylcholine. So black widow venom, you know, the spider, it will cause muscle contractions and so leads to a violent death. Also an agonist of ACH, sometimes it's on the test, so be aware, is curare. Curare is like a poison that in South America, the natives put on arrows and that would like freeze you, okay, paralyze you. So it's an antagonist. So be aware of those. Just agonist mimic and antagonist block the effect. All right, and so your drugs are often agonists and they are agonists and antagonists. Okay. Also, don't forget excitatory and inhibitory. Excitatory makes the neuron fire. Inhibitory will prevent it from firing. So to reach threshold, you need enough excitatory neurons or neurotransmitters to make the neuron fire. For standard 3 with your nervous system, you've got to know the divisions of the nervous system, all right? You have a chart, use it, all right? The brain and the spinal cord are the central nervous system. Peripheral is everything else. You want to know that the autonomic nervous system is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is fight or flight. Know that your pupils dilate, your breathing increases, your heart rate increases, all those kinds of things when you get aroused in your fight or flight. Parasympathetic kicks in after the fright and then calms you down. It's the rest or digest. Know your neurons. This is one people struggle with. Motor neurons or efferent neurons. It's messages that exit the brain and go to your muscles. Sensory neurons are also called afferent neurons. Those are messages from your senses, your eyes, your ears, your mouth, your nose, that send messages at the brain. So afferent, at, motor, efferent, exit. Okay, and so it'll send the messages to your brain. Inner neurons are in your brain and spinal cord, and they are the in-betweeners, okay? In between the brain and the spinal cord, and they're the relays in between the motor and the sensory neurons, okay? So remember those. Here's your autonomic nervous system. Know the effects of sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Those are super easy. They're on the chart. I think you can handle that one. Your endocrine system, know that hormones travel through the bloodstream so that it's slower, but the effects last longer. Know that testosterone is the major hormone involved in the sex drive, always on the test. Pituitary gland is the master gland. The hypothalamus is the region of the brain that controls the glands. So it controls the pituitary, which secretes hormones to turn the other glands on and off, okay? It's also, if you see something about growth, it'll be pituitary. Remember, adrenal glands produce adrenaline, non-adrenaline, or often called epinephrine, norepinephrine, okay? Pineal gland won't be on this test. Pancreas, if it says pancreas, it's insulin. And so those are really the basics. So hopefully you do really well on this test. Study, do your Albert IO, and you should do great.